Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 7, Climate Science. This is video number 20. We're going to be looking at some of the changes in species. Our learning intention is to investigate flow-on effects of changes to climate, including but not limited to changing range of species due to rising sea levels. So one of the final things that we need to do in this little section, this third section of climate science, is to have a look at some of the consequences, or at least potential consequences, of climate change on species. Now, the World Wildlife Fund identified significant and unavoidable consequences of carbon emissions. They list increasing temperatures, shifting precipitation patterns, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and increasing intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. And this small list includes some of the things that we've already been discussing in this little section of video. So we've looked at ocean acidification, we've looked at weather patterns and the intensity of certain types of events such as bushfires or droughts. And so what we want to do now is we want to see if we can tie some of these things in together. Firstly, on this one we haven't talked much about, or at least we've talked about in an oblique sense, sea level rise, but also in a more specific sense in terms of the sorts of things that have been identified as contributors to species change and potential extinction. Two important things that WWF has also looked at, a little list, I guess, of some of the threats to species across all regions. The main one, of course, is changes in land or sea use. So human activity has certainly had an impact on different species in terms of what we have wanted to use the land or the sea for and how that has impacted on the organisms that were previously living there. That's about 50% of the change is kind of attributable to that. About a quarter is over-exploitation of species, so overfishing, over-hunting, certain types of species that we've taken certain materials from. All of these forms of exploitation have contributed to about another 25%. About 13% for invasive species and disease, about 7% for pollution, and then about 6% which has been attributable to climate change. So we're not talking about the most significant impact at this stage on the populations of living organisms, but we're certainly starting to see some significant impacts of climate change and how we might be able to measure them. One really interesting thing that's come up, and I guess it's gaining a lot of traction at the moment, is citizen science projects. Now, citizen science is basically trying to encourage people who are not scientists per se to be involved in aspects of science, environmental studies that help to give us a little bit of an idea of maybe what types of organisms are in certain types of environments, or at least what their distribution is around either a state, a country, or the world, and also how things might change over time. There's a little thing called Coast Snap, which has actually been set up to allow you to use your mobile phone to take pictures of the beach. These pictures can then be uploaded and then the beach tracked over time. And certainly for places like Stockton Beach, which is quite local to Newcastle, where we have seen a huge amount of beach erosion happening over a relatively recent period of time, this sorts of data, which we can collect just by different people at different times, popping in, taking their photos, you get a nice continuous record of what's happening with the beach. You can actually see what is actually changing as a result of any of these changes in conditions. Now, there's a couple of places where these kind of little coast snaps of structures have been set up for people to take photos and to upload them. And it's worth having a look because I think they're a fantastic way of contributing to science, but also a great way of being able to track the sort of things that we've been talking about in this module. So what's the deal with sea level rising? Well, rising sea levels have been linked to climate change. We've talked about that both in terms of thermal expansion and also the small amount of meltwater that's actually increasing the total volume in the oceans. Now, that is starting to become more significant, but at the moment we still see the thermal expansion as one of the contributing factors. So both of these potentially very important contributors to sea level rises. We know that the rates of sea level rise are currently increasing, and the two main consequences of that are for low-lying regions is inundation or flooding, and for a lot of the coastal regions, it's beach erosion, such as the stuff that's happening at Stockton that I talked about on the previous slide. The problem is, as far as New South Wales is concerned, 80% of our population lives within 50 kilometres of the coast. So that's a big proportion of the population in New South Wales that are likely to be impacted by these changes in sea levels. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, predicted a couple of potentially concerning sea level increases, about a metre by 2100 and maybe as much as 2 by 2150. Now, of course, these are long-term predictions. They assume certain things, and hopefully what they don't assume is the fact that we're going to take some significant action in trying to turn around some of the issues associated with climate change. But of course, if they don't, if we don't, then these sorts of concerning trends are just going to continue, and they may end up having some very significant impacts, especially on those communities that are very much dependent on a coast lifestyle. But this is also about species. This isn't just about sea level. So what's actually going on here? Well, we know that there's a number of different impacts, and we know that climate change is just one of things that humans are doing that's actually threatening the survival of quite a number of different types of organisms. But we do know, despite the fact that it may only come in 5th on the list of things that are directly responsible for extinction, it's rising and it's not insignificant. And so therefore we need to have a little bit of a look. Some of the studies that have been carried out, and there's quite a number of them, so I've just picked one really just to give you a bit of an idea about some of what we call the proximate causes. So one of the things that happens when we're looking at climate change is we're trying to sort of get a sense of what are some of the flow-on effects. If the sea level rises, then obviously the plants that are closest to the sea, those that are salt tolerant, will start to have to move back, I guess, away from the shoreline to have any chance of survival. We know that the animals are reliant on plants. They're the heterotrophs. They rely on autotrophs in an ecological community. So if the plants move, if the plants can move, of course, but if they move, if their distribution changes, then obviously the animals need to go with them or their food source will disappear. And this is one of the things that happens, is we get these flow-on effects occurring as a result of some of the changes that we see happening. So a 2012 study identified a few of these kind of proximate causes, which I think are worthwhile just talking quickly through as we complete this particular video. The first one is related to temperature, so the limitations in physiological tolerance as the temperature changes. So this can change activity time, it can increase energy maintenance costs, it's about whether or not organisms are endotherms or ectotherms, whether they rely on the external environment to help create heat in their bodies or to transfer heat, or whether they're able to generate that heat internally, such as mammals are. That can change as the temperatures continue to rise, because we also need mechanisms to help us to cool down. If the temperatures get too high, we've got to have those ways of being able to cool our bodies. So there may not be sufficient physiological tolerance to higher temperatures that may limit the ability of certain types of organisms to cope with changes, particularly fast changes. And this is one of the things that we're always talking about, is the problem is the rate of change. And any organism or group of organisms are going to be able to show some level of adaptation if they have time to do that. As a population, they can shift towards one end or another. But as individuals, it's very difficult. As individuals trying to cope with things that are happening in your environment, especially if something like a bushfire comes through, that can be a very difficult thing for you to be able to get yourself out of the way or somewhere where you're safe. The same thing is true about precipitation. If the rates of precipitation change, and that can mean wetter or drier, and those two things are often dependent on whether we're talking about freshwater species, aquatic species that are marine, or terrestrial species. And each of these are going to have different types of tolerances for different amounts of water. The precipitation can create habitat loss for freshwater species, or maybe we see species that do different things at different parts of their lifestyle. You're all aware of salmon moving from the marine environment into a freshwater environment to reproduce. And so maybe there's going to be some interference with those sorts of organisms that do that sort of thing in their life cycle. There may be water stresses and perhaps even death in terrestrial species where droughts are prolonged and we have no opportunity for them to be able to recover that lost water. Climate-related impacts can also have some impact on beneficial species. So we can find extinction or decline in prey species, pollinators, or host species. So this is one of the problems if you're a predator and you have a particular prey that you specialize with and something happens to that prey, that's going to affect the predator species. Pollinators, we've talked a little bit about bees and the change in bee pollination, in bee populations and how that affects pollination. And also for certain types of parasitic species that need a particular host. Those host species, if their numbers drop, we can also have considerable problems in that area too. It's not just beneficial species, of course, it's harmful species as well. So talking about those sorts of things, a prey species whose numbers are kept under control by a particular predator, if that predator were to disappear, then the numbers of prey species could grow out of control. Competition, loss of competitors could mean drastic increases in the abundance numbers of particular groups of organisms, and also pathogens themselves can run a little bit riot. One of those things that once the situation changes, different species respond to change in different ways, and that's probably the point that I'm trying to make there. And also the fact that we've talked in previous videos about the fact that there's been some slight changes in terms of seasonality, warmer weathers, cooler weathers, drier weathers, wetter weathers that are impacting seasonally on different types of organisms. And so those that have tied their activity times to particular parts of the year, maybe the day length, for example, photoperiodism is quite a common trait in certain types of species that's often a certain length of day which triggers maybe the reproductive cycle to begin, or certain temperatures are reached, and that's the same sort of thing. So these cues can be triggered perhaps a little early, and therefore there can be some slight changes. And especially if there are mutual relationships between different species, if one's sort of getting going too quickly or too late, then there can be less overlap, and perhaps the things that happen to support these two species working together aren't working in harmony quite so well. These are all called proximate causes because they're not a direct consequence of climate change in one sense, but because the climate has changed or is changing, there can be flow-on effects into different types of organisms. And this is how species can quite significantly change over time, and obviously how some of them actually may disappear over time too. We'll have a look at a couple of these examples in class, but hopefully this just gives you a little bit of an overview of some of these important characteristics and implications of climate change on species. Thanks for watching.